A Sacramento children's author recently got a prestigious recommendation from the Smithsonian Institution. Its National Museum of American History has developed activity guides for one of Patricia Newman's books. The book is titled Jingle the Brass. She's in our studio. Patricia, welcome back to Inside.
Thank you for having me.
How did this come about? Do you propose this to the Smithsonian, or do they say, hey, by the way, this is what we've done?
They invited me out to do a signing in October for my other book, Nugget on the Flight Deck.
Which we talked about when you were last on Inside.
Exactly. So I visited both National Air and Space Museums doing signings and a little reading. And I think the book buyer who purchased the books for the National Air and Space Museum also buys books for other museums in the Smithsonian Museum complex. And after visiting the National American History Museum, I said to her, Jingle the Brass is about trains, and you have a huge exhibit about America on the move, transportation history in America. And I think that just might have jiggled a few synapses, and she probably told somebody who told somebody else, and lo and behold, the activity guides popped up.
What does that mean, an activity guide? What actually has been produced that works in collaboration with your book?
Well, I have them here, and some of the activities include reading the book with your children, or if you're a teacher, with your students, and incorporating the book into play. So if it's a young child, perhaps that child has a train set at home. So after reading Jingle the Brass, one of the activities is to try to incorporate some slang from Jingle the Brass, such as hogger for engineer. So
hogger, that's an engineer?
Right. Use the word hogger instead of the word engineer.
I guess I need to do the activity guide too.
I think you need to do your homework. And one of the other activities is take this menu that was on a particular train, a real menu from a real train, and sort of translate it using some of the lingo in Jingle the Brass.
Were you involved in creating this activity guide?
No, I wasn't, which is it's not so surprising that I wasn't involved, but it just made it even more pleasant to see all of the wonderful activities they came up with.
And what did you think when you saw the activity guide? Did it please you?
Oh, absolutely. Anytime one of my books is connected to the Smithsonian, I can't help but be pleased.
Yeah, I'm sure it doesn't hurt. Patricia Newman is a children's book author. Her book, Jingle the Brass, has been recommended by the Smithsonian Institution. Its National Museum of American History has developed an activity guide in conjunction with the book, Jingle the Brass. It's a funny title, Jingle the Brass. What does it mean?
Jingle the Brass is one of the slang terms, and it means ring the bell.
And this is from the olden times, I guess, of trains.
Jingle the Brass is set in about 1926, I think the editor and I decided. We had to pick a particular spot in time to help the illustrator.
Why 1926? You said you decided on that.
It just seemed to fit with the slang and the sorts of images that the editor had in mind.
Yeah. Was that the kind of images and period that you had in mind when you started thinking about the book?
Definitely. The age of steam was very popular in the 20s, and my book is definitely a throwback to the age of steam. There are no diesel engines in my book. These are the days when brakemen walked on top of the cars to check the brakes, and that is a big safety no-no now in the railroading world.
Yes, I guess so. The diesel trains do seem a little less romantic than the steam ones.
They do.
Yeah. What's the book about? Is it sort of like a historical snapshot, or is it a fictional story?
It's a fictional story. It's the unlikely scenario where a boy meets an engineer in a diner and goes for a ride in the cab on the train, not as a passenger, but he's in the cab on the freight train. And similar to Nugget on the Flight Deck, where the child actually flies with the pilot, this child takes a ride with the engineer.
Sounds like a wonderful experience. Was that something that you'd heard about or experienced yourself, or was this totally out of your imagination?
It was totally out of my imagination, but I have to say, I interviewed a retired railroad engineer at the California State Railroad Museum. They were particularly helpful in making the library available to me, making people available to me to interview. And in fact, I started with a completely different idea for older children, actually young adults. And after I interviewed the railroad engineer and he used all of this slang just in basic conversation, I completely changed ideas, wrote a completely different book.
There aren't too many steam trains around nowadays. How do you know young kids are interested in steam trains, let alone modern trains?
Have you ever met a kid that's not interested in trains?
Well, I certainly was. I loved trains when I was a kid and probably still do. So it's your experience that kids today still love trains.
It is. And I've signed this book to as many model railroaders who are adults or retired railroading men as I have kids. It's just a love that never seems to go away. Patricia
Newman's new book is Jingle the Brass, and you're going to read from the book for us. Where about in the book is
this is the very first page. It gives you a good idea of how the engineer is drawing in the boy as he comes into the diner. And he says, "Mornin', I've been waiting for you. Pull up a stool and put on the nosebag with me while I finish my breakfast. I like my eggs with headlights, but you'd like scrambled. Just order wreck on the main line. Ruby there'll know what you mean. Better add some whitewash to that. A young'un like you needs milk."
Eggs with headlights.
Right.
I love that expression. I just saw the cover of the book. That's a great illustration. It looks like this train is just hurtling off of the cover.
Michael Chesworth, who is the illustrator, lives in Amherst, Massachusetts. He did a fabulous job. His color palette reflects the 20s. His watercolors are detailed and, for the most part, historically accurate. When sometimes he does veer away from history, however, to bring in a little humor. There's a page in the book where hobos are, quote, nailing her on the fly, which means they're running up the hill and jumping aboard the train while it's moving. And he has all kinds of funny things going on with those men. Some things that are really bring a child into the page and help them pore over it. And again, while they're not historically accurate, they're kid-friendly and just amazing to look at.
Now, the book is physically large, but I'm sure if you counted the number of words, it's not that many words, relatively speaking, which probably leads a lot of people to think, hey, I could do that too. It can't be that much work to write a book with this few words in it. But you described a lot of research and interviewing.
I did do, it was an area that I was not familiar with. And this book does have a glossary in the back to help kids not only learn the basic meanings of the lingo, but it gives a little bit of historical information for older students. When you write a book like this, the mood, the setting, everything counts. It all has to be real. And the last thing you want is somebody say, hey, that's not accurate. And in fact, this book went through a lengthy copy editing procedure. Every single fact was checked.
Now, there's this activity guide that the Smithsonian has created in conjunction with your book. But on your website, there's a teacher's guide for Jingle the Brass. Is that something separate?
That's something that I created. Yeah. And now that I've
You're a former teacher.
I'm a former teacher, yes. Now that I know about the Smithsonian guides, my web designer doesn't yet know this, but I'm going to ask her to to add the Smithsonian guides as well.
Yes. What are you going to do next? I mean, you've had some success and acclaim already with these two books, Nugget on the Flight Deck and now Jingle the Brass. Can you tell us what you're working on next?
I'm working on a young middle grade novel, which has a slew of little boys in it. A lot of it is taken from my husband's childhood, as a matter of fact.
What part of his childhood?
Mostly just the goofy characters he hung out with.
Yes.
But it's a little hard to describe right now, but I'm hoping that I have that to my agent after the first of the new year.
And finally, Patricia, also on your website, I read in the page that's titled The Truth About Writing for Children, you wrote, it's more competitive than writing for adults, which seems surprising.
It really is, because You stopped me. It is more competitive because so many people think they can write for children and they think it's accessible, but it's really a very difficult skill to learn how to do, because if you're writing picture books and are not the artist, as in my situation, you have to have the perfect blend of text, and you have to know what to leave in and what to take out, so the illustrator has room to make the story his own. And that hobo page I described in Jingle the Brass is a place where the illustrator really came into his own. He brought his own personality into the book. And I had to learn not to describe every single nuance in my story.
Because if you'd been writing a novel, you would have had to fill in that gap there, making sure we know what the hobo looked like.
Exactly. Picture books are their own breed. It's very, very difficult to write a 600-word satisfying story and still have enough faith to allow the illustrator to add to that story and make it complete.
Patricia Newman, her new book is Jingle the Brass. Patricia, thanks for joining us.